is your time, your special safe space to actually talk about politics, to talk about environmental issues with people who have been trained in the same way as you to be empathetic. We use a lot of Brene Brown's material to talk about daring leadership. So instead of being armored, somebody who tries to like basically put your head down, get the answers right so that nobody knows that you don't know necessarily everything about the topic at hand, instead we embrace making mistakes, saying, I don't know the answer to that, but maybe I'll ask somebody else. So from the beginning, I try to build a sense of community, but also what I call skill build. So we make sure that we have some tools to use as we move forward in the class, talking about really difficult topics, maybe the type of topics that the last time you mentioned that you might disagree with somebody, they called you a name and walked away, or who knows what people have already experienced when they've tried to like speak up about their own political views. So at this point, I think coming into my classroom, I really like to create spaces where people feel like they can be heard, feel like they belong, and then also have opportunities and different methods of being able to show that they understand and are learning. So there's a lot of little personal written assignments, pretty low stakes things that you can answer, like journal entries kind of things. And the final project is often open-ended or a podcast, so that you can use your creative side to help communicate what you've learned, because at the end of the day, the class is only as good as what you can do with it when you integrate it into the rest of your life. So can you create a podcast or a video blog so that you can, I don't know, use it to get a job, or just communicate with somebody who maybe won't sit down with you and ask you about your class, but now they can watch your really cool video you've created. As I look back at some of the students who've taken the class with me before, there are just so many impressive things people do when they start going, oh, it's not an academic paper, this is me trying to communicate what I believe and what I've learned with other people. So communication ends up being like the biggest thing, science communication, political communication, so that students, again, feel like they're doing something and that other people can hear them. So I started the syllabus for this course, The Politics of Placemaking, thinking about the question of home as it relates to environmental politics. So what do you call home? Who gets to call a place home? Where do we belong? And then what does it mean to physically construct a home or a building in the world today? So students come to this course potentially never really critically thinking about the idea of home, who's in their current house, maybe what other homes look like. But by the end of the course, we've not only talked about the US as somebody's home at different levels, we've talked about border walls, we've talked about urban planning, feminist politics of homemaking in Bell Hook's words as a site of resistance. So I think going through all of these nuanced questions about home in a very simple way, we end up really making the issue complex and hoping that by the end students think much more deeply about where they feel situated, but also about including other people. And I think at the end we end up talking about Iris Marion Young's essay, where she goes through a lot of these topics, and she ends with, it's about democratizing the idea of home. Home itself's not a bad thing, but withholding home from other people, the safety, the community, the essential needs from people, all of those things are what's getting in the way of our radical democracy that we've been looking for in the US. So going through all these different questions and all these different ways of looking at a topic, that's like the interdisciplinary method. So again, by the end, we've talked about colonialism, we've talked about settler colonialism, we've talked about capitalism and all kinds of different political perspectives on human rights. But we're all looking at this idea of home. By the end, the students can appreciate maybe all of the different ways people come at that topic and hopefully go away with more questions than ever, but also a little humility about what it means from wherever they're situated in home and where they'd like to be maybe in the future and how inclusive their spaces are. That's one of the big features of one of the films that we watch. We watch climate refugees, and also this mini docu-series by Thomas Friedman, or he is working with filmmakers to talk about climate change in the US. He talks about the droughts in California and desertification over in Africa, and tries to make all these parallels that what we're experiencing here is not, isolated, is that things are happening all over the world. They're affecting people to different degrees, and how we experience things. There's a lot we have in common with people who don't live in Texas, may live in different parts of the world, and there's also a lot of people with solutions too as well, to help mitigate some of the effects of climate change that are already happening, but also to help adapt to a changing world with more people who need more things like air conditioning and other appliances. So there's a lot we talk about in my classes that are related to that, but not about just complaining about how hot it is, but maybe trying to understand the science behind it and how people are solving those kinds of problems. So I try to make sure that by the end of the course you're like, oh, there's so many solutions out there, which one am I going to be a part of? Oh yeah, fictional accounts, artwork, I noticed documentaries, all different formats of ways that people view these topics can help also bring the emotional human side of problems that might seem so confusing and complex, and really just boil it down to stories about other people that you can relate to. So I definitely admire all the artists, documentary makers who are making that their mission to spotlight things like that so that we can find a connection and then use that connection to go do something about it. So I've taught that course for about 3 years, a very similar version of that course at Virginia Tech, and we draw from the natural sciences. I have people in horticulture, like arborists, come in to speak to the class. We have students from across campus who will be coming in here on this campus. So basically, wherever you're coming from, whatever questions you have, again, we just go seek out answers from people who are experts in their field, scientists, people in the humanities, artists as well, who offer a very unique way of helping us view the world and its particularity. So we have all kinds of different activities that make sure that there's something in it for everybody. So my PhD is specifically interdisciplinary studies.
Oh wow.
So this winding road to Virginia Tech. So starting off, I grew up on a farm, so environmental studies is what we were doing. So I grew up outside. I grew up planting things with my family. So we have a small family farm where you're out there planting the plants, you're out there watering, you're learning about irrigation. And then your free time you're spent in the dirt. You're literally, sometimes you just sit on the ground and it's enjoyable. As you're growing up, you're just so in touch with the outdoor world, even when it's hot. So when I was growing up, because you're out from the morning to the evening, maybe working at the stand, in the way that a lot of people who are in the air conditioning all day don't realize that you can actually be outside all day if you're like, I think the idea is like if you're the frog, right, sitting in the boiling pot,
exactly.
You don't realize it because it's just slow. So that's kind of how I think about the heat, that if you're in it all day, it's almost like easier to deal with. So growing up on the farm, working at the produce stand, a lot of people would come out of their air conditioning cars and be like, it's so hot. And I'm like, you must be experiencing it different than me. Yes, I'm hot, but it's manageable, and we're doing work that we love outside. I like working with flowers and the herbs and things, so every spring I pretty much try to go back to the farm and help with the flowers and things, and a lot of customers ask questions, so I'm learning more and more about things that I can advocate for in terms of like gardeners and consumers with plants, like native plants and things. So that's what I enjoy doing, it's what I grew up with. So then there's this other aspect of asking bigger questions about, well, why doesn't everybody get to enjoy the outdoors? Why are there people who have no idea what the difference between lettuce and cabbage is? And just all these questions I think I've always had. I'm somebody who's like a student of people, so I like to, like I'm a people watcher. I like to understand though where they're coming from, and I think at some point I was just like, doesn't anybody have answers to these questions? So I think I kind of slowly got into philosophy and the humanities and social science is like psychology, to try to understand people and then to understand these bigger questions about connecting to nature as well. So my first degree after my bachelor's degree is in political science. So I was at Vanderbilt and I did American politics and political theory and fell in love with political theory because it is interdisciplinary. It's people who are looking at problems, and they're willing to talk to scientists about them. They're willing to think about how the government's involved, how social planning is involved, how the psychology of people actually influences the political choices they make. So you could think about polarization today, people who are fearful about things and how they have reactionary politics. You have all kinds of different big questions that you're always asking about politics. Going back to my love of nature, all of that kind of coalesced into my dissertation, which is related to agriculture politics in the US. So I was looking at the United States Department of Agriculture and how it's talked about farmers since the beginning of its bureaucracy, which was at the end of the Civil War. Well, I think one of the big things I discovered through my dissertation research is that we need to talk about the US as a settler colonial state, and if you understand that as a structural context for land politics in the US, a lot more makes sense. So you have a lot of indigenous scholars who've been pointing this out. I bring those into my courses so that we could hear in their own words. They've talked about from the beginning the way the US government has been set up, the way it awards private property rights, the things that it values as opposed to other things. So to understand the government, understanding those structural things, also understanding the way capitalism comes into play when we think about what policies work, what policies are realistic. Those are bigger questions that we address in my courses, that if you don't realize that, you can feel like you're hitting your head against the wall because you're like, well, this person just says this will never happen and this isn't realistic. And again, it's doom and gloom unless you understand the bigger forces. And once you understand things, then you can start understanding maybe where you can make a difference, or where if you explain it to somebody who has power to make a difference, they might make different choices too once they understand the implications. I think of us as people who are in systems that a lot of times we can't really change, but once we understand we're in the system, we actually can act a lot differently in our roles and use our power for good, or potentially don't do anything so that we're not using our power for bad. So those kinds of things really have come up in graduate school. That was the last leg of my education journey so far, and I think that was a really transformative experience for me. Growing up on a farm, that's not necessarily the environment where people are going to be talking about, critiques of capitalism and settler colonialism. As you talked about farmers before, and their land politics and the types of policies related to large-scale commodity agriculture in the U.S. has a lot to do with these systems and continuing to make sure that there's a lot of economic growth and also international security. So when we think about food production in terms of national security and making sure that the US holds its own on the world market, all of those types of things also influence why farmers and agriculture in the US are so important at election time. Family down here, and I've been looking for a special fit for me career-wise. So I just finished up my PhD at Virginia Tech and finished remotely, and I was also teaching here in the spring political theory and contemporary political thought for political science. So I fell in love with the campus. The students are fabulous here, and I was really looking forward to finding a full-time position, and I found one. Maryland, okay. Yes, which is very far away from here, so it's a very different environment. So geographically speaking, weather-wise, I grew up amongst the fish, the Chesapeake Bay area, lots of waterways. So coming down here, it was like traveling to almost a completely different country, because it is a very different part of the country. So this for me has been actually a very generative transition in life, from graduate school to teaching in a new environment, especially teaching environmental politics. I get to explore new questions and new terrain, if you will, about the environment.